Hey everyone, today I'm going to be starting off a video series specifically on the CKA, doing exam prep for the entire exam. The CKA is the Certified Kubernetes Administrator. It is proctored and run by the Linux Foundation and essentially shows you that you know how to set up a Kubernetes cluster, you know how to maintain it, and you know how to troubleshoot if anything goes wrong in the cluster itself. This way, you can show employers and your current employer you know your stuff. This video series that I'll be doing will be going over all of the base knowledge that you need to know in order to pass the exam. You'll need to do some hands-on stuff in order to know the troubleshooting process, but it will give you a foundation that you can use going forward. Even if you're not doing the exam, you can use these videos to actually garner some knowledge about Kubernetes in general. If you are a CTO, if you're a developer that's looking into Kubernetes, or you're an administrator or sysadmin that's actually trying to break your way into the Kubernetes space, in the cloud space. There are some external resources that I suggest you use, but definitely some of the things that you'll need to know in order to go into the exam itself is how to find information within the official documentation. Trawl through it and try and find information is something that you'll be able to do during the exam itself, so finding particular pieces of information is just as important as knowing things. We all Google all day in our jobs. I don't think I know a single developer that hasn't at least done 5 or 6 Google searches in their run of a regular day, so get used to trying to go through the official documentation. It is the only other tab that you're allowed to have open. In order to pass the exam, you'll need to answer about 24 questions. These will be on various topics, and I will go over the specifics that you'll need to know in this video, and I'll break it down with how I'm actually going to set up the videos as well. But you have 24 questions, you need to pass about 66% of them, and it's all done through a terminal that they built into a Chrome web browser. So you'll need to have nothing else running and an empty room with just the official documentation and the terminal for the exam itself. Like I said, the exam is broken down into 5 sections that you'll need to know. They're worth different weights, so you can focus on what you need to focus on, but I'll break them down based on the videos and knowledge that I believe is necessary for the exam. The first section is worth 25%, and it is configuration, installation, and architecture of Kubernetes. This section focuses on the fundamentals of Kubernetes, what it's running on, how you're running it, the workloads, the nodes, and the architecture, as well as the components that keep the cluster ticking. First 2 videos that I'll do in this section will be on Kubernetes architecture. One going over the overview of the components that run on a control plane and the worker nodes, and the second one will be the node architecture and how the networking works between nodes in the cluster. The next video I'll be doing is on kubectl. This is your view into the Kubernetes cluster. It is your lens. It is how you see what is going on, so you'll need to know how to work the command in the best possible way. You'll also need to understand how to use kubeadm, which is the Kubernetes way of installing everything necessary on a server to bring it into an existing cluster. So you'll need to know how to bring a node into the cluster at any point. After that, I'll kind of go into installing the basics, which is for the components that will be on the control plane, managing the control plane, and doing more with kubeadm. If you are following along, I do suggest trying out Kubernetes the hard way with Kelsey Hightower. He goes through in depth and without using any external tools to do the basics, so it gives you some good hands-on experience in that realm. One of the major components that is a part of Kubernetes is the etc component. This is where you have a key value store of the state of the cluster itself. So as an administrator, you'll need to understand how to maintain this data store as well as do a backup and restore it if necessary. So I'll have a video on that as well. As well, you'll need to be able to control the access that users will have into your cluster. This is done through RBAC, role-based access control. So you'll need to understand how to manage that. And that's all you need to know in terms of the first section. Moving on, the next section is worth 15%, and it is workloads and scheduling. This is how you'll understand how to manage the workloads that are going on to your cluster. These are the applications, the deployments, the services, the networking, all that kind of good stuff. You'll need to have a high-level view of it in order to actually work with it. Since you are not developing but just maintaining, it has a lower weight for that reason. The first subsection here is going to be deployments and rollbacks. This is how you're going to manage deployments and application changes that are going into the cluster itself. I'll go in depth of how to set up the deployment, how to do a rollback, and manage deployments directly through kubectl itself. The next video is configuration. This is how you're going to decouple the code from the environment. So that way, the same code will be running in development, it will be running in production, and any other environment that you deem necessary. So that way, you can just provide these to the code and it will run as necessary. Next, you'll need to know how to scale an application within the cluster itself. This will be done through not only deployment, but other means that are metadata aspects in Kubernetes primitives. So I'll be going over that in this video. On the topic of Kube primitives, I'll have an entire video that is just dedicated to going from the very, very bottom unit of what Kubernetes is, which is a pod, all the way up to deployments and stateful sets and services and networking as all the component pieces that users will be using within your cluster. On the scheduling side of things, I'll be going over resources, taints, and tolerations, which dictate how an application is scheduled in your cluster, whether or not it's going to go on a separate node from a different pod, or if it's moved into its own little area. This way, if you have a production environment running, if some other workload is on the same node, they don't collide and break your production. And then we'll be going over some manifest management, which is just to give you an overview of some of the tools that are out there. You just need to have an understanding of what they are and how they can be used. The next section is a little bit more meaty, and this is on services and networking. This is how you're going to stitch together workloads in your cluster so that way they can communicate easily. So you'll need to know how to work this, and it's worth 20%, so you know it's necessary to know. Of course, as an administrator, you'll need to know the node networking, which is how the nodes and host machines that are running containers are communicating to one another across the entire cluster. And then I'll be going over services, which is how pods will be able to communicate with one another when they are mortal and they can lose their exact address. You give something that's abstract that can just be pointed to despite what happens to a pod that's underneath of it. And then you have ingresses, which is how your pods will be able to communicate to the external world, or you get some traffic from the outside world into your own cluster and into the workload. And last but not least in this section is going to be core DNS, which is the domain name system that Kubernetes uses within the cluster itself. You'll need to have an understanding of how this works and how to troubleshoot if anything comes up regarding this component. The fourth section here is worth 10%. It's not as heavy as the others, but it is just as important, and this is storage. This is how you're going to make sure that you have volumes and information accessible to the pods that are ephemeral and can die at any point. So you'll need to have an understanding of how to set up persistent data or just volumes in general that can be used by the workloads within the cluster. With that in mind, I'll be going over first storage classes and persistent volumes, which is how you'll be able to give persistent volumes and data stores for your workloads. Then I'll be going over access mode, volume mode, and reclaim policy, which is what happens when the pods that were using that volume disappear, what happens to that volume, and also what access that pod has to it, if it has read or write only, or read-write. And last, I'll go in depth of the various different volume types that exist out there, which is partially dependent on what kind of cloud you're in, whether it's on-prem or in AWS, GCP, or Azure. The final section here is going to be troubleshooting. This is the big meaty piece of everything. This is your strip loin. This is what you need to chew through in order to actually become a real administrator of Kubernetes. It's worth 30%, so don't skimp on this and understanding what you need to do. With that in mind, I'll be going through the different things that you'll need to understand to troubleshoot and where you can look for this information on your own. The first being cluster and node logging. Where can you find the information that your nodes are giving out? What are the logs, the standard out of the nodes themselves? So that way, if a networking failure happens or something happens on the cluster itself, you know where to look for it and how to remedy it. Then I'll be going over monitoring, which is how you'll understand where you can get the information and the many different ways that you can access the metrics in the cluster, so that way you can quickly find out where the issue is. Maybe a pod is running way too hot and you need to delete it or replace it or find out what code issue is on that pod so you can fix it and get everything back to a green state. As well, because we're talking about applications that are running in Kubernetes, you'll need to understand how to get to the container logs and gathering the STD out of the container. So that way, if the application is running badly, you can dig right in and see, oh, it was a log error here, and you can go from that point. As well, you'll need to be able to troubleshoot application failures. So that way, if you know that, say, this container is failing and it's the application, what steps can you do in order to remedy it, fix it, and keep everything green? Diving back down into the low end of things, you'll need to understand what happens when a component of the cluster itself dies. What do you do when etc is gone, and how do you remedy it? And the worst case scenario in a distributed computing system is network failure. What happens if nodes can't communicate to one another? What steps can you take to remedy that? On top of all of these sections, I'll also be going over some of the important pieces that are just for the exam themselves. So that will be systemd, OpenSSL, and Vim. These will help you in the exam itself and give you some base knowledge necessary for being a Linux administrator, which kind of comes first with regards to Kubernetes. So that is it for the exam. I'll be going over all these videos individually, but this is a great intro way. And that's it for the entire exam. Of course, go through the videos so that way you understand it. I have links in the description as well as cards during each video description, so that way you can quickly go between all the videos from this video in particular. All of these videos will be kind of idempotent, so that way you can watch them individually. They're a series, but they are separate in a way that is just that little module of knowledge. That's it for now. Good luck!